Good evening, folks, and welcome to another titular episode of It Came From Beyond the Mic. I'm your host, Cortez. Before we start with this week's episode, I just want to say spoiler warning. I'm trying to get that down. Half the time I remember to say spoiler warning in the beginning, half the time I forget. I want to get that out of the way, spoiler warning. And also, I want to ask you, my loving audience, if I should make a Twitter for this podcast here. I had mentioned it in the past on my 5th episode, and now I'm mentioning it again on my 10th episode. I'm going to mention it like every 5 episodes until I make one, I think, which I know it's like annoying, but consider that's like 5 weeks of time between each time I ask it. So, I'll make another straw poll. Last time it was a resounding no, which is why I'm asking it again, which is fine. I was literally 5 episodes in last time, and the audio sounded like shit for until episode 7. So, now it sounds good, and I'd like to make a brand Twitter, if possible. If it's not wanted, then I'm not gonna fucking do it, but, it's worth asking, whatever. This week, our film is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the first one. This movie's pretty good. It's old, whatever the fuck. Half the shit I've watched is old, whatever. This movie's pretty old, it's pretty good. It's not the most amazing horror movie I've seen, but it's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is, iconic. But I won't lie, I'm definitely covering this on the podcast right now just so I can talk about the sequel, because I kind of have this understanding that the sequel is better and also probably more fleshed out in some of the character ideas, as far as Leatherface goes and stuff like that. I haven't seen the second one. I was actually going to watch it sometime back after I had seen the first one, because I saw the first one not too long ago, rewatched it for the podcast. And then I was going to watch the second one, but then I never did. However, now I can watch the second one blind and then cover it on the podcast, so that's pretty nifty. But more on that soon, next week, really. Haha. I'm not covering Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 next week, but you'll see. Anywhom, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1, though, is kind of awesome. It very strongly wants the cannibal holocaust effect, and I think it did garner that kind of idea around it, because immediately the film starts out with a text crawl that is explaining the story as though it was an actual event that happened. So it can kind of be gathered that the movie you're watching is sort of a dramatization of an event that had happened, the event known as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think compared to other films, it probably didn't have too much of the cannibal holocaust effect, but, correct me if I'm wrong. I was not alive at the time that this movie was out, so I don't know what audiences at the time thought of it. All I know is what I know and how I feel about it. Which, I do like this film. I don't think it's a top 10 anything for me, but it doesn't really need to be. Again, I'll see my thoughts on the sequel, but I should shut up because we're not talking about the sequel. We're talking about the first one. And the plot premise is, y'all know them Texans? Yeah. So it's like a group of teenagers, and I guess they're going to visit a grandfather's grave. I believe the grandfather is of the main protagonist, Sally, and her brother, Franklin. So I think it's their grandfather's grave, but then by the time they get to the grave, it's all defaced and stuff like that. It's like an effigy or something. I think there was grave robbing going on, and it's like, whoa, that's spooky. So then they decide to go to a childhood home, and when they get there, it's not in good condition. It's like a rundown place, it's abandoned building pretty much, which is kind of weird, but they still hang out and they remember where the old lake is, so then they go swim in it and fuck around. So it's got this simple premise of oh, here's some teens on a trip, like a lot of slasher flicks, primarily the Friday the 13th films. It's oh yeah, on a trip, on vacation, what have you, but then the killers arrive. Granted, I did skip a couple details. So, on their way after they go to the graveyard and on their way to the childhood home, they pick up a hitchhiker, and he's a weird fucking guy. He has a camera, he likes taking pictures, he lights gunpowder or maybe not gunpowder, but some sort of flashing powder shit in a aluminum foil in their fucking van when he's with them. He cuts Sally's brother's hand open, and there's blood, and it's really fucking weird. And then they kick him out, and he's really mad about it, but he comes into play later. So, they have a weird run-in with a hitchhiker. It's ooh, that's spooky. Ooh. where will this go now? So everything seems relatively chill. They're just hanging out at the lake house. And then, I can't remember who wanders off first, but some of them wander off, and they find this other, like, mansion. I guess you could say it's a mansion. Maybe it's more of like a farmhouse. I'll say farmhouse, whatever. So they find this farmhouse, and they're kind of investigating it, and I think they need gas is the problem, so they're, like, knocking on the door, trying to see who's home. Who do they find inside? But the villains. It's weird to say villains, I don't know. They find a family. And I'll get more into the details of this family, but I'd like to take a quick ad break if you don't mind. Shout out to this week's sponsor, Anchor. Anchor is the platform I trust most to host this very podcast. Anchor's interface makes it very simple to post podcast episodes for listeners all over the internet. If you need an easy-to-use and free website to host your own podcast on, I'd say turn to Anchor. And for those of you tuning in on Spotify, just know that these episodes wouldn't be on Spotify without the help of Anchor. If this ad was what you needed to hear in order to get your own podcast going, then download the free Anchor app or visit the website at anchor.fm to get started. Once again, thank you to this week's sponsor, Anchor. So within this farmhouse, we find a cannibal family that is, they're all men. I'm sure there was a mom at one time. Some sort of matriarch or some shit, I don't fucking know. But it includes that fucking hitchhiker that I mentioned earlier, that guy. And then, spoilers, as I always talk about, they stopped at a gas station earlier in their trip, and the gas station owner is actually, like, the dad of the family, of the cannibal family. So he seems like a normal guy, but he's actually fucking cannibal dad. So the hitchhiker's one of the sons, and then Leatherface, or Bubba, he's another son. And we, in this house, we stand Leatherface. Thank you. And there's also their fucking grandfather, who looks like a corpse. It's immensely funny, and more on him in just a moment, but fucking, the grandpa character's kind of funny to me. So the protagonists, they, one by one, kind of go into this house. They get fucking murdered. They get put on meat hooks. They get a hammer over the head. They get stuffed in freezers. Fucking, it's violent. It's not like insanely violent, but it's pretty fucked up. Like the scene where the character gets put on the meat hook. Ow. Can you imagine getting fucking meat hooks dug in your back? It makes me think of, I'll mention it again, Dead by Daylight, which Leatherface is in Dead by Daylight. I talk about this game a good bit on the podcast. It's a horror video game. I've mentioned it before. Basically, it's like a slasher versus survivor PvP game. I'll just, quickly sum it up. The Leatherface is in there. Getting put on a hook makes me think of that, because when a killer catches a survivor in that game, you put them on a hook, and then they struggle unless they have a teammate who can help them off. It's a whole thing. Pretty good game, I'd endorse it if they endorse me. I'd like a little bit of money for mentioning that. No. It also makes me think of another video game. I'm a gamer, what of it? So it makes me think of another video game, Dusk, by New Blood. The New Blood Studios, New Blood Interactive. I don't know what they go by, but the New Bloods. It's a really good, like, throwback first-person shooter indie game, which probably sounds bad, but if you've heard of the game, then you know it's fucking awesome. I love this game, and I've played it a lot. But the game starts with your character, like, jumping off of meat hooks that they were put on in a basement, so it's pretty kick-ass. I don't know, there's a lot of meat hook stuff out there. Also, Candyman's getting remade. I haven't even seen the original Candyman. I think it's on Netflix. I'll probably cover it on the podcast soonish. Not important. Anyway, meat hooks suck. Imagine getting put on one, fucking hurt your back, ruin some muscles back there. So you'll notice like that the family's kind of like, without, for lack of a better term, butchering the protagonist because they're a cannibal family. They have a lot of gross stuff around their house. Like, I think one of the more iconic things is the red wall that has like a bunch of animal skulls on it. That's probably one of the most notable features of their house. And I think that is part of a little hallway that leads to the kitchen area where like the meat hooks and the freezer are. So there's like a lot of cool details in their house, and it's really fucked up. Anyway, eventually Sally gets lured to this house for whatever reason. I think it's after her brothers died, and I think most if not all of her friends have died, so she's the final girl. and she gets brought into the house, and then they start having, like, dinner in front of her, kind of, or they have her for dinner, or whatever cheesy shit. So they tie her up, they capture her, and then they're gonna have their grandfather, like, bash her over the head with a hammer, which will then, kill her, and then they can flay her as they desire. So it's like, it's a really insane scene, because, like, characters are cackling, screaming, as she's screaming. Her head is over, like, a tin little basin thing that they're gonna, I don't know, I guess put her blood in. And it's Bubba Leatherface helping the grandfather, like, put the hammer in his hand so you can, like, weakly bash her over the head. And it's pretty gross, because, like, the hammer hit lands, and then you see, like, a big gash on the back of Sally's head. She manages to escape, and she's running through the woods, and it's just a really frantic scene with so much, like sweet Lord energy. It's pretty great, because she's running through the forest at night. It's pretty hard to see stuff in the movie, but it's kind of got, like, a blue look to it, because, moonlight or what have you. Running through the forest, hard to see shit, but Bubba's chasing after her with his chainsaw, and he's, like, cutting through the forest, trying to get to her as best he can. It's fucking wild. She also escapes to the gas station that I had mentioned before, and she's like, oh god, help me, he's chasing after me. And then it's revealed that the fucking gas station owner is the dad of the cannibal family. He brings her back to the house, and then she escapes again, believe it or not. All this taking up the course of an entire night. So by the time it's morning, she's still running through the woods from Leatherface yet again. The whole family wants her dead, because, she's the final girl. And I think the ending is, like, super iconic from this movie, specifically. I feel like when everybody thinks of the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they always think of the ending. Sally is covered in blood, she's running from Bubba, and there's this 18-wheeler truck that stops, and he's, like, trying to, like, help, like, the driver gets out, he's trying to help her. I think he gets killed by Bubba or something like that. Or maybe he doesn't, I don't remember. I think Bubba kind of tunnel visions on Sally. And then this pickup truck this pickup truck drives by, and Sally runs and jumps into the back of the pickup truck. And she's just screaming madly while she's covered in blood, looking back at Leatherface as he, like, waves his chainsaw through the air, just slashing at nothing in frustration. It's so, like, fucking insane of an ending, but I could see why it's iconic. Just the visual of, like, sunrise, kind of. Yeah, it's pretty much sunrise, because, like I said, it took up the course of a night. She's looking back at Leatherface, just screaming like a fucking mad woman. And I think Bubba's, like, hollering too. It's pretty good. It's a good ending, more than, like, some of the other events that happen in this movie. Again, though, it's not a bad movie. I'd say watch it to say that you watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because it's iconic. It's a classic. You gotta appreciate the classics around here. But really, it isn't bad. Not by any means. It's just, like, in comparison to, like, other things that have come out, probably even its own sequels within the series, it's probably, like, just, like, an alright movie. It's pretty good. It's not bad, not great. I'd say, watch it if you're in the mood to see some Texas Chainsaw Massacring. Or if you just want to get familiar with the series, it's a good place to start, considering it's the first fucking film, so haha. I think those are all my feelings and thoughts towards Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Pretty good overall. But I want to thank you, the audience, for listening in on this episode of It Came From Beyond the Mic podcast. I'm your host, Cortez. Also, I'd like to let you know that my podcast is actually available on a lot of other platforms currently. So Anchor, who is, currently my sponsor of the podcast, has put my podcast on all sorts of platforms. Initially, it was hosted on Anchor, and then Spotify, like pretty much right out the gate since I started using Anchor, it was put on Spotify. And then I've been using YouTube for a while. As of late, Anchor has put my podcast on 4 different platforms. It's on Breaker now, it's on Google Podcasts, it's on Pocket Casts, and on Radio Public. So if any of those are something that you would much rather listen to my podcast to on, then knock yourself out. I'm kind of spreading the brand, even though Anchor kind of did it for me. I would like to get my podcast on iTunes sometime in the future, but I need to figure out how to do that. I've heard that you need to pay. I've also heard that you just need them to approve you. So I've heard a couple of mixed things, but I think I can achieve it within this next year. So for you, like, Apple users out there, I could probably hook you up. Regardless, that's all I need to talk about this week. Again, I appreciate you very much for listening in on yet another episode. I was your host, Cortez. I hope you all have a good evening and good night.